And from the Temple in Independence, Missouri, welcome back to CIMM Sessions, our little bite-sized servings of theology, culture, and community of Christ, identity, mission, message, beliefs, and practices. Again, I'm David Lloyd, the director for CIMM, the Center for Innovation in Ministry and Mission, through the Graceland University and Community of Christ Seminary. Great to have you all here with us once again. We are now going into part 4 of our series called To Question, Community of Christ Theology. And we have just gone through 60 years of, not literally, 60 years of the presidency of Joseph Smith III, now into the 20th century, and the trickle back into Independence, Missouri, and some dark days of the United States coming forward. But we're talking about how theology and our culture as a faith movement coincide, and why we are the way we are today. And so joining us once again is Dr. Tony Chvala-Smith and Charmaine Chvala-Smith, who are once again with us, and we appreciate you coming by and sharing once again.
We're very glad to be here, and welcome to everyone to our 4th presentation in the series called Question. And tonight, our session is called Vision, Division, and Mission. And we'll get to all of those eventually and kind of begin to meander through a new era, sometimes disturbing era, unsettling era for sure.
And so, as our custom is in each session, we want to remind you on a couple of levels what we're doing. And these 2 texts from our Doctrine and Covenants provide the anchor points of the trajectory, right? So how did we get from 1831, quote, the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth, end quote, to 1996 and beyond, claim your unique and sacred place within the circle of those who call upon the name of Jesus Christ. In Community of Christ, we have to be able to answer the question, how did we get from the earlier theology to where we are today? And that's part of what we're doing in this series.
Good. And one of the things we would like to pop in here as we think about that huge change from Doctrine and Covenants 1 to Doctrine and Covenants 161 is to just to make a note back about Joseph Smith III. He comes in at a really critical point, but he brings with him what I'm going to call Methodist sensibility for kind of a middle way. And he primarily is lifting up the heart of Christianity in the midst of all kinds of squabbling and debating and figuring out what to leave behind and what to make room for ahead. He creates a new center, perhaps not a new center, but a stable center where Christianity in the traditional sense is the core. And that provides the stability and for the future.
So that's part of the answer for how you get from A to B here. Another answer is that, like Fred M., one way you get from 1831 to 1996 is you do graduate study with the famous psychologist G. Stanley Hall. And then you read the social gospel theologian, we'll talk about this one later, Walter Rauschenbusch. And what you discover is wisdom and depth and authentic gospel faith, among others, and find that their concepts help amplify the reorganization's, in this case, Zionic principles. And so you can't be the one and only when you find that there's more than you saying the same things you are, and with the same kind of authority and authenticity.
And that you might actually want to use some of their stuff to even make your point stronger. And in this case, with Fred M., it's about Zion. So we're looking at these differences, this huge change from 1831 to 1996. But we also want to affirm that at the same time that all these things are changing, there are also some important themes that span the entire life of the church from the 1830s and persisting to today. And some of those themes, and they'll keep coming up. So if you're watching this in the series, you'll keep seeing these and hearing these, but I want to name them so that we see that though there's changes happening, there's also a core. There's the threads that run all the way through. So Zion, the idea of Zion, either as a community or later as peace and justice, as Christ's peaceable kingdom or the reign of God, that's strong all the way through. Idea of ongoing revelation, that God still speaks. The idea of prophetic leadership, the goal of changing the social fabric for good by working to alleviate suffering in the world. Those are all there throughout. And there'll be more too that some you may have already recognized and some we'll name as we keep going.
So what is theology? We have to keep asking that question. And it's a question we actually like to answer
over and over
We
and
do.
over again.
So a little slightly different twist in this session. So theology it's a verb, right? It's an activity. And it is fides qua intellectum, faith seeking, understanding, with the operative word there being seeking. So whenever we try to understand why do we say this, why do we believe this, how can we do it this way, that's theology as a verb. But also theology is a noun, and that's kind of what we've been focusing on in the series. It's the product of the process, right? It is the beliefs, thoughts, practices, actions, and teachings that shape the life and identity of a religious community. It would be doctrines, sacraments, self-understanding, practices, and so on. So theology is a verb, and theology is a noun. And when theology is a verb in your life, that becomes your way of making a living, actually.
Mm-hmm. So another thing that we really think is important as we begin each of these sessions is the idea that though tradition is important and we are approaching Community of Christ theology and the development of it chronologically, so we're going back through the story. So though tradition is important, church history is not our message. And sometimes in our past, it was. Our history, our story, and our message were the same. And that means the message was about us. And so what it is, though, and I think that's the thing, again, we need to keep affirming, is that our message is about Jesus Christ, the good news of Christ. And so we need to keep those two, the theology and the history, they depend on each other, but they're not the same thing.
So session 4, vision, division, and mission. And I'm thinking Fred M. had division. It caused some division, and it was part of the church's mission to pursue his vision. And so one of the things we want to then focus on in this session is like this shift in leadership, both in style and persona, from Joseph III to Fred M. This coincides with some really significant seismic cultural, economic, historical shifts in American culture and in world culture as well. And so I'm borrowing from the late Paul Edwards here. Joseph III was an old world man. That is, he was schooled in the traditions of the 19th century. Fred M. is a new world man. Though born in 1874, he is very much a forward-looking 20th century person. He's not living in the horse and buggy world anymore. He's living in the world of trains and automobiles and rapid transit, science. Yeah. So there's a significant cultural shift that takes place from one leader to the next.
So among the different things that are happening is there's industrialization. Cities are drawing whole new generations away from agrarian lifestyles towards these centers of industrialization. Factories, assembly lines, unregulated wages, lack of concern for the health and safety of workers. All these things create huge disparities and eventually labor disputes some of them violent. The Great Depression is during Fred M's time as well. It impacted the global community, and it hit the church really hard, especially since the church, with Fred M's encouragement and kind of necessitating changes, had begun a lot of new projects that were going to be costly. And so it got very complicated. And the world is beginning to feel smaller and more dangerous due to worldwide conflicts. And this is, context is so important. And as we look at Fred M's presidency, it begins, 1914 is when he begins, but begins with World War, it ends with World War I, and then World War II. And so there's a lot happening in the world, as well as in the church. So a question that seems to have been at work in Fred M was, how could a church formed and framed by old world assumptions change and thrive in this strange new world? Could the reorganization offer a timely, relevant message in this new context? I think that question and ones like it fired Fred M. Smith's imagination and his energy, which, especially in his early, as a young adult and early adult, seemed to be endless. So the result was transformative changes in the reorganization's theology. And we'll be mixing a little bit of the storyline, some history, as well as how is the theology, how is that faith-seeking understanding changing, developing, maybe some things going away, some new things entering the scene.
And I have to say that question is a question for Christianity right from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
How do we move from one context and one set of world assumptions to another?
Mm-hmm.
Every shift in Christian theology is very much like that. So the question might have felt new to us, to him, but it wasn't a new question.
Yeah, and it's a witness of the versatility of the message of Christ. Can it be translated into each new time, into each new circumstance?
Absolutely, and one would say that what makes a living religion living is its ability to navigate.
Keep doing that,
right?
Yeah.
So we want to just acknowledge some of our sources tonight, and make some suggestions. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on Fred M. Smith, but for tonight, our like the historical framework of what we're doing, basically we're using Dick Howard's Volume 2, The Church Through the Years, and especially Mark Shearer's second volume of Journey of a People, and a one-volume history that the late Paul Edwards wrote many years ago called Our Legacy of Faith. And when you work with all three of these together, you get kind of a panoramic view of the Fred M. Smith era. And I should say, if you don't have the 3 volumes of Mark Shearer's book, you need to get them. You need to put it on your Christmas list. So I've mentioned already that the shift from Joseph III to Fred M. is a shift of worlds, right? It's a shift from the horse and buggy world of mostly rural Midwestern America to the rapidly industrializing, urbanizing world of Fred M. Smith of the 20th century. And so that is going to make a significant kind of shift in church life. You can't go on pretending that it's horse and buggy days when people are driving to church in cars now, right? It's everything just changed. And so also it's really important to think too that Fred M. inherits the church in a sense from his father. And the church he inherited was a church that had been held together beautifully by Joseph III's very irenic, peaceful personality, his ability to create a big tent and let some things just be okay. And everybody loved him. And yet, from Fred M.'s perspective, what he got was not one church, but 14. all of the historians say this, that there was the church presided over by the presidency, there was the church of the presiding bishopric, and then there were 12 separate churches, each governed by their Council of 12 member with their own, putting their own stamp and personality and sometimes rules on that particular church. And so that's what Fred M gets. And it's like, he's like, seriously, I'm supposed to run this?
And something to just know about this time period is that the apostles, the Council of 12, would often during this time, they might have lived in the area where they were the administrator for a long time. And so their theology was influencing the congregations in their area. Their leadership team, those people that they went to for leadership within that area, was very deeply established. Their knowledge of the people, their knowledge of their circumstance, but it was also very easy then, especially in Joseph III's later years when he was not so actively involved, that much of the leadership did go to the apostles in their areas, and so you could have very different understandings of the church's purpose and theology depending on the apostle that happened to be the one who'd been residing in your area for a time. And so that sense of there being 12 different churches depending on which apostle you had, and that there wasn't unity in purpose, theology, or even understanding of what the church was about. So what kind of prophet did the church want? Did it want a figurehead, or did it want a leader? And what were they about to get? I'm not sure. I think some people had an inkling, others did not. An analogy came to mind as I was thinking about this today, is if you have a river and there's a log jam there and the water's not being able to flow forward and things are all stopped up, it might be time for a little stick of dynamite. And in some ways, that is what Fred M. was. That's what he did. He wanted to have the river flowing freely, but in one direction.
And you should be careful what you want. If you want a prophet to lead you, you should be careful about that.
That's true.
So let's talk about this new context just a little bit. And theology is always done in this give and take reciprocal relationship with culture, right? There's no theology that's dropped from heaven, and yet theology relies on reflection on revelation, and yet it always does that within a cultural context and framework, and that shapes how things sound. Medieval theology sounds medieval because it's from the medieval period, right? And so in this new context that Fred M. has experienced, this is now a world that in some respects is much more familiar to most of us participating in this session. There's a picture of a factory, of an assembly line, and that was going to shape working life for lots of people for a very, very long time. It was no longer going to be you just assumed that church members were from a small farm and that their life followed the farm schedule, the seasons and so on. Church conferences when there were two of them, there was one in October after harvest season, right? So things focused around the farm schedule. It's not going to be that way when people have moved into cities and they're getting jobs in, Ford Motor Company or Buick Motors and so on, and they're working on factory lines. And so lots of things then are changing in cultural life in terms of what people value, what people's time is like, how people are paid, how they make a living, and so on.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things about Fred M. Is that he was not afraid to vision big. So he had been a counselor to his father for
a long time.
Quite a long time. I'm trying to think before he became the president. Oh, yeah. And so, and he had worked and lived in different parts of the world in the church. Mainly in the US. And so he had seen a lot of what the church was. And I think of what he's doing in this new time period is that he's seeing ways of moving the pieces of the puzzle around and even adding some new ones, ones that come from the culture and are compatible with what he sees as the church's most important messages. And he also, these pieces of the puzzle that he's adding to it are often very action oriented. They demand living in a new way or in a different way or a more radical way. Unfortunately, some of the pieces that needed moving were people, leaders with their own field of ministry, their own visions, their own job descriptions, and their own sense of call, and who did not necessarily have the same vision as Fred M. And so at the beginning of his presidency, there is a great deal of conflict and division as he, in different ways, demands loyalty and that his authority be recognized and followed. There's a lot of dissent, division. I mean, if you like watching reality TV, you might have enjoyed the World Conferences where there might be debates for 4 days over some of the issues that were before the conference.
The 1919 General Conference would have been like the best of all reality shows when Fred M says, if you don't give me the authority I need, I'm going to resign. In fact, here is my resignation.
Right. And the leaders and conference are like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And so, yes, tumultuous times that people hung in there, worked through, some new directions came, but we'll go on to with some of the theological and well, some of the things that are happening.
So one thing that's happening now that Fred M is president is that he's got a kind of a more global vision than the church had before, really. And so he makes a trip to England. And in that trip to England, he runs across a young church member named F. Henry Edwards. And F. Henry Edwards, while Fred M is in England, becomes kind of like his concierge or something, kind of helps him as
an
assistant, right?
Secretary.
And it apparently they really clicked because a few years later, F. Henry Edwards is going into the Council of 12 as a very young man. Side note on F. Henry Edwards is that he had been a conscientious objector in World War I, which is a whole other story. It's quite interesting. And I mentioned to Charmaine earlier, I really would love to have sat in on conversations between Fred M., who's a very patriotic nationalist kind of guy, and F. Henry Edwards, who not only becomes a Council of 12 member, but later becomes Fred M.'s son-in-law. I just kind of wonder, I don't know, what was Thanksgiving like in that house? You kind of wonder about.
And so we have here a picture of the auditorium. This was conceived of and begun in early in Fred M.'s presidency. It's big. It was really big. And lots of people were in the church like, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to afford this? It was begun the ground was broken in 1926. And if you know history, you know what happens in 29 and 30 and the Great Depression and all of those kinds of things. But he dreamed big. He had a big vision, and that there would be a place that we could have as a church to meet in, but also that there would be a place for the community, for activities within the community. And so with great sacrifice by many people in the church, it finally was finished. There had been some conferences held in it before it was completely finished, but finished in 1958. So started in 26, finished in 58. But this is the other point I wanted to make about Fred M.'s ability to help people see the vision, to convince people that this was the way to go, that these were ways in which the idea of Zion could be realized and recognizable within the community, within independence, but also within the church at large.
And I got us out of sync here. But yeah, so but
okay.
Then our next point is about his ability to persuade. He's a very persuasive person. So
and with that is right from the beginning and throughout his time as prophet president, Zion. Zion is crucial. Zion is real, and he wants it to become realer, to become physical, to take on meaning in economic and community terms. And so he kind of taps into that latent desire that many older members would have had to realize a gathering of people again, a city that can live out this other way of being, this alternative way, this peaceable way.
So Fred M. stressed education. He thought education was really important for priesthood ministry. In fact, he was the very first graduate of Graceland College when Graceland College was teeny tiny.
And a 2-year degree.
And a 2-year degree. And he had transferred there from basically Iowa State or the University of Iowa, transferred there with his credits. And I think Mark Shear says he was awarded a bachelor's degree because he'd already earned some. So education remained important. Fred M. is a church president with a PhD. He gets a master's degree. He goes on to a university in Massachusetts, studies with G. Stanley Hall. Another church member had been there and recommended Floyd McDowell, who actually who becomes a counselor to Fred M. eventually, but had been there already and said, you need to go to this program. And so the story of Fred M. doing his doctoral program, his dissertation, as his father is reaching his last days, and as they're approaching the conference in which Fred M. is supposed to be ordained prophet president, it will give you PTSD just trying to figure out how did they manage all that in an era when to travel from Massachusetts out.
Well, and they didn't.
Gosh.
He got sick and he wasn't able to be present for his own ordination.
But it was under Fred M. later that there's a Department of Religious Education that forms at church headquarters. And, Fred M. had the opportunity to enter into waters that few church members in that era were able to enter into in terms of education. And so here he is. He's basically got a PhD in sociology and psychology. He knows a lot about science. He taught math briefly at Graceland. He's well-read in philosophy. And as we'll find out later, he's aware of the larger religious and theological world. It's going to be very important for how he frames Zion in Community of Christ.
Good. He continued with some of the youth programming that had begun before him and emphasized it even more, both development for children and youth. Again, education, becoming articulate, that youth groups were a place where youth could be protected from the bad things within the society. And so very much a sense of awareness of what the next generation needed.
And then also Fred M. is very much aware of contemporary technology, right?
Yes,
So
that's right.
Yeah, so he advances the cause of using the radio to communicate the church's message. And under his leadership, the church starts its first radio station in Lamoni, and then it starts one in Independence at Stone Church, just a few blocks from where Charmaine and I are standing right now. And so he also contributed sermons on the air to a broadcast called Church of the Air broadcast that came out of Philadelphia, I think. Anyway, he's using the current technology to communicate the church's message and to communicate with church people in place of being there in person when it's just not easy to do. So now let's go.
We're going to jump very intentionally into a theology in his time before his presidency, but while he was still working on his master's and doctorate, that theology that was very much in the day. It's very relevant to, thank you, current, very relevant to the struggles of his time. And it really resonated with him.
And that theology is sometimes referred to as the social gospel movement. Here's a basic definition from the Westminster Dictionary of Church History. It's just a nice, simple way to get your mind around what the social gospel movement was. Quote, a movement chiefly among American liberal Protestants to Christianize society by applying the biblical principles of love and justice to such institutions as the family, the state, and the economy, seeking to redeem corporate as well as individual life. The dates for its major phase were about 1870 to 1918. Fred M. is born around 1874, and he's just a few years into his presidency in 1918. And it's quite easy to see significant influence of social gospel theology on Fred M. and in some of his actual statements and writings. So this is section 137 of the Doctrine and Covenants from 1938. Quote, "Let the church be admonished that the times are portentous and demand faithful adherence to the faith and work of the church, that mankind may be blessed by and find peace in those religiously social reforms and relationships which have been divinely imposed as a great task of achievement." Right? Religiously social reforms. A very important historian many years ago wrote a 2-volume work on Fred M. Larry Hunt wrote this 2-volume work called The Saint as Reformer. And in some respects, I think it's fair to see Fred M. as having lots of reformist impulses. And he got a lot of horsepower for this out of the social gospel movement. As Mark Shearer notes in Journey of a People, Fred M. saw Zion as religion socially applied. Now, what that means in the 1920s is quite different from, sadly, what it's come to mean in the 21st century, where there are all kinds of misanthropic tendencies in religion. But then it's quite a radical and progressive thing to imagine. And so the chief architect of the actual theology of the social gospel movement, though there were many practitioners of it, was the Baptist theologian and church historian Walter Rauschenbusch. And Walter Rauschenbusch served for a while as a pastor in Hell's Kitchen in the heart of New York. Extremely well trained, very conversant with contemporary German Protestant liberal theology. And this fellow became a household name for lots of Christians in this period, roughly from 1907, when he published his first book, up until he died in 1918. His first book was Christianity in the Social Crisis, published in 1907, and it is an earthquake of a book to read. And one of the things he does in this book is he begins, and this is the social gospel generally, he begins by exploring the principles of the Hebrew prophets and showing that their primary concern was with inequity and injustice against the poor in ancient Israelite society, that's what the prophets were about. And then he traces that into Jesus's ministry and Jesus' message of the kingdom. Rauschenbusch's second book, Christianizing the Social Order, 1912, a very large book. And we have a copy that was given to us that actually it has Floyd McDowell's name in it, right? Floyd McDowell, one of F.M. Smith's counselors. So you know that Fred M. was
influenced by,
yeah, he's in the ballpark with people who are reading Rauschenbusch, and there were church members reading Rauschenbusch at the time. And then Rauschenbusch's most famous work is A Theology for the Social Gospel, and it is really kind of the magnificent kind of Magna Carta of what a social gospel theology is about. And so the basic issues here have to do with, in the rapidly industrializing culture of the United States, incredible injustice is being perpetrated against workers, against immigrants, and there's a huge wealth disparity that is emerging. And social gospel theologians are saying these wealthy guys are going to church, and we're not saying anything about this. Seriously?
Right. And, there's a picture here of a girl in a fabric factory. And because people were not being paid a living wage, their children, too, were working in the factories just for the families to survive. And they were being taken advantage of, obviously. And, little or no safety mechanisms, small children being hired because they can crawl into the machinery and fix things that adults couldn't. And so just as dehumanizing of those who are already poor or marginalized within the society. And Rauschenbusch sees it and names it and says, this is not consistent with Christ's message.
And so he argues in his books and in his ministry. He spoke everywhere. He tries to say, look, the message of Jesus is about the kingdom of God on earth, and the message of the kingdom is drawn from Jesus's Jewish heritage of the prophets, and it has to do with a just social order here and now. And Rauschenbusch says, unfortunately, Christianity for centuries has been thinking about heaven when Jesus was talking about earth. So social gospel theology appealed to the message of the Old Testament prophets, which emphasized concern for the poor and for economics, and on Jesus' message of the kingdom of God, which social gospel thinkers interpreted in utopian terms as a just economic and social order built by people committed to social righteousness, right? And so that's going on in the culture. Fred M. Smith is highly well read. He knows this, and you begin to see lots of social gospel themes just showing up in Fred M. statements. Here's three.
One of the things we had wanted to do tonight was to see if we could get one of the recordings. There are some recordings in the library of some of Fred M.'s sermons or presentations, but we weren't able to find ones that were compatible. So maybe another time.
So here's from some of his sermons. Quote, the prime law of Christianity, love of God, has never yet had its full social application by being closely and generally coordinated with the second great law of Christianity, and so like the first, to love neighbor as self. In other words, if you call yourself a Christian, if you say your society is Christian, and you say you love God, you better be loving neighbor. And by the way, neighbor is the workman that you're not paying a fair living wage to. Then he says elsewhere, admit then that we are socially and industrially activating on a wrong basis. What is the remedy? The answer is obvious. Christianize the social order. In other words, we've got to apply the best Christian principles we know to the social and economic world we live in. And then this longer quote, Fred M. says, it is the duty of the church to develop and promote this social consciousness and agitate such social reform. The pulpit must stand for social reform, denounce selfishness in all its forms, and free itself from the charge of being subservient to the interests entrenched behind the bulwarks of self-serving interests, i.e.,
big corporations,
big corporations, big donors who are funding lovely churches, and then churches are like, we owe them what we've got, and so we're not going to say anything about what they're doing to their workers, right? So Fred M's all over that, and he's speaking against that. It's not enough, he says, to preach the entrance of a mystic kingdom of God into the heart, but a kingdom of God come in the form of a regenerated and ideal society where righteousness prevails and justice walks unhampered. That's what we're supposed to be about. And so Fred M. sees that the social gospel movement and its theology really clicks with Zion traditions that he has inherited and that he is interpreting. And there's a picture of some boys who were working in coal mines. Child labor was a huge thing this time, Charmaine mentioned. Fred M. says, as followers of the Nazarene, it is our determination to work continuously for these ideals, believing that the church will live its fullest life when it fosters the needed social reforms and concerns itself with bettering the conditions of labor and production. He's not anti-union, by the way. So I think that's really quite important. And then he starts turning some of this into song, right?
We thought this was interesting to have a song that Joseph Smith III wrote last time, Tenderly, Tenderly, and then to get a sense in the hymnody of how Fred M. approached that.
Yeah, and as soon as I start saying the words, some of people watching this are going to start thinking the tune, I just guarantee you. Onward to Zion, faithful and strong, Zion the beautiful beckons us on. Onward and upward, battle along. Zion the beautiful beckons us on. Onward to Zion, to Christ we belong, service the watchword, we fight against wrong. Oh, by wrong, he meant social injustice and wrong. Right? Onward to Zion, march with a song, Zion the beautiful beckons us on. You might not have known that hymn is kind of an early reorganization social gospel anthem. We have some other ones too, but that one is definitely shaped by some of that.
Yeah.
So,
and so just to give a bit of a balance on the person of Fred M., though he is speaking strongly for reform and fighting against wrong, it's really important to realize that Fred M. was opposed to disorder and social instability. And I mean, thinking about his context, Great Depression, 2 wars, you can understand why having stability within his country seemed really important. He disapproved of protests against government policies, especially if they were violent. And so he didn't always see that the system created the kinds of marginalization that he was speaking against. He would have seen corporations and other entities as being the cause, greediness, selfishness. But he couldn't necessarily see that already built into systems that there was a marginalization that was intended. And so he shared many of the racist views and conservative social ideas on social issues of his time. As might be expected, since he saw Independence, Missouri, USA as the center for Zion from which goodness would go out and change would go out, he valued his country and as the home of the church very highly. So today we might call him nationalistic in the milder way than we may be seeing it today as in Christian nationalism. And I would say to humanize Fred M., like many of us and members throughout the church's story, the prophet too was not always able to stand outside of his cultural context to see the bigger possibilities of peace and a more just world. But he was human. He never claimed to be anything else. And we are all on that journey. I wanted to add in one little piece here. We've got a few minutes before we need to do questions. As we were talking about this, as Tony and I have been looking at this for the last week or two, and looking at the conflict that Fred M.'s vision created among leadership in the church, it really dawned on me, and I was really inspired by the reality that this took hold. It made changes into the very theology of the church, sometimes among the leaders, but always in people, in the members, in the general members and the friends of the church, in the places where they lived. You know, we often, when we're talking about the theology of the church, we talk about the leaders or the president or prophet and their thoughts and actions, but it's the people in the congregations were the ones who were making the theology live and letting it shift their view of the world. Their ability to perceive and respond to this vision and their sense of call for the church, even in the midst of the conflict among church leaders. Lots of church members got a little bit disillusioned in some of that battling in those first years. But most of them stayed and tried to see the subtext. What is it that God is calling us to do and be in the midst of this upheaval? And church members heard Fred M. They were able to adjust and develop their theology. People caught the vision and saw ways to implement that Zionic impulse that was so important to Fred M. into their own contexts. And we don't have an actual photo of it, but this was a flyer. Ron Romig, who is an archivist for the church for a number of years, found this and wanted us to see it. So it was a flyer that had been sent out into the community where there was a congregation of our church. And these are the things that were on it.
Yeah, I simply transcribed them from the flyer, but the flyer would have been something they took door to door. And read this and imagine taking it door to door in the United States today. I actually like to imagine doing that.
Well, and you'll see that it says the Latter-day Saint program, which here we're still in some settings, still trying to say we're the true Latter-day Saints, still that, as we talked about last time, the Mormon boundary and the Protestant boundary. So that's one thing to realize. But then what are the things that this new view of our theology is, what shape does it take?
Social reform by individual regeneration. Every man having opportunity to be his best, to do his best for the good of all, right? Love the dynamic, righteousness the principle, justice the basis of social relationship, to organize such men and women into the kingdom of God, to provide all with suitable means, which with their talents become their stewardships. each one being brought to the task he is able best to perform, the product to be distributed so that none has less than is needed and no one has more than he can use. Gracious, how radically socialistic. And yet these are church members who are catching this vision, and this is what they're going around sharing. This is what my church is about in the 1920s. So I think that's pretty cool, actually.
So again, just that sense that members and friends of the church are part of the theology that's developing. We, members and friends of the church, we are the ones who embody the vision, make it real, make it lived. We are the ones who hear and take it in and live out the vision of Christ's peaceable kingdom, God's loving reign. We are the ones who have bake sales and raise money for camp programs, plan vacation Bible schools, stock pantries, sign petitions, and challenge injustice in the towns and cities and rural areas where we live, work, and worship. Members and friends of the church are the ones who risk growing, risk letting go of some things so that our hands and our hearts and our minds are open to the Spirit's inspiration and creativity. That creativity that can bring beauty and love, justice and peace to touch the anguish in our world. It was true in the beginning of the last century. We've been talking about Fred M. Smith here, and it's true in the first decades of this one.
So as we conclude here, let's look at another trajectory. We seem to like trajectories and timelines, don't we? But 1924, a quote from Fred M. It is the duty of the church to develop and promote this social consciousness and agitate such social reform. The pulpit must stand for social reform. Right? 2007, Doctrine and Covenants 163. God, the eternal creator, weeps for the poor, displaced, mistreated, and diseased of the world because of their unnecessary suffering. Such conditions are not God's will. Open your ears to hear the pleading of mothers and fathers in all nations who desperately seek a future of hope for their children. Do not turn away from them, for in their welfare resides your welfare. That is actually a very Rauschenbusch-like thought, because Rauschenbusch had a very strong sense that we are socially interconnected. We are in this together. But by the way, we brought this up because there's this, sometimes people think, oh, Community of Christ, all this social justice talk, this is recent stuff. It's just the avant-garde.
It's just a fad.
No, it's not a fad, right? This is we have a 100-year track record of this kind of stuff. And so it's really important for us to remember that what Fred M. was trying to put to words with the help of social gospel theology has been part of our journey since then, and it's just come more to the fore in the last couple of decades. And finally, here is Fred M. And Ruth's grave at what is that place called? Is it Mound Grove.
Thanks.
Charmaine and I stumbled in there we took a late summer walk one day, and all of a sudden we're surrounded by dead church people. But the superscription there, sit tibi terra levis, may the earth rest lightly on you. Lovely thing to have inscribed on one's gravestone. But Fred M. didn't get to see the things he hoped for, and yet that task is passed to all of us.
He began many things. Some of them were complete in his lifetime. Some were seeds that would sprout and bear fruit later, and in our time too.
So now, David, we have time for a few questions.
Wonderful. Well, good to have some time to share together and have a few questions. It's fascinating to see 60 years of a president who was an agrarian, bringing people together, very pastoral, very pragmatic, and then you have Fred. And I guess it is the pendulum swing that we always have through both culture as well as generations and things along that line. We have a needed change as we are growing into going from the frontier, basically, the Civil War, so to speak, and a place where our church could hide if we needed to.
Yeah, yeah.
And now into a place where cities are growing and industry is growing, and with that comes some horrors socially. And so we are able to see Fred moving, especially after getting an education, first prophet in our church to have a degreed education, and moving into a place where he understood the world differently. And I believe also he in his in his prophecies to the church went into third person when he spoke them in some cases.
I think some of them start.
Yeah, and which I've always found interesting. Going, in other words, going from saying God is saying to you to saying, I hear God saying, I interpret God.
The Spirit to me is X, and
Yeah. And so with all these changes, and we didn't talk about it too much with Joseph Smith III, but with the beginnings of the church, we're kicked out of Missouri.
Mhm.
We're thrown out, and for some good causes also. And yet this idea of Zion still kind of sticks with us, and it's unplaced because it definitely didn't happen in Nauvoo. And yet there were social things happening in Nauvoo. I think of the Women's Relief Society and other things that were taking place that were seeds for this. And then we come into being dispersed and coming back together and trying again to reframe that concept of Zion. And the word Zionic comes out.
Yeah.
We're not talking about a place. So how is it important for us to go from Zion being a place to Zion being a concept?
Well, actually, it's gone back and forth here, right? Joseph Jr. was very much a place guy, right? It's here. No, it's here. No, it's here. Joseph III and the church in his day had the memory of the problems of gathering. The idea of gathering is still very much there. And people sometimes push on Joseph III and say, when am I going to gather? And he's like, it's got to be the right time and blah, blah, blah. And oh, by the way, I've got tomatoes growing in the garden. Would you like to see them? And so he tends to start thinking of it more in terms of a relational concept. Fred M, though, bounces back to he wants to put flesh and blood on it in places, and so the church buys property here locally in Independence and in Jackson County, and he wants it to be a flesh and blood sort of practical, pragmatic, visionary thing. So he goes back to place in some.
Well, it aligns with the social gospel too.
Yep.
Right. Israel following him, will say something like, Zion is no closer nor no further than the spiritual condition. So we go back and forth.
It's balancing it the other way again.
So,
but it moves from place to concept.
Right.
Yeah.
To physical, to spiritual, to relational. There all of these aspects. It keeps getting shifted back and forth a little bit, rebalancing it. Fred M's vision of independence being a real center and having social services, taking care of the poor, expanding education for nursing and the hospital,
Right.
All of these things, very, very much saying, how is a culture put together? How do we construct something that points to Zion, creates a taste of Zion, creates this place where you can begin to understand it with your head, but live it, and that's the only way it can become real is if you can imagine it and then you take action, do something about it. So it's going to be both a concept and a reality for Fred M. As Tony said, Israel is going to make it be a concept again, more of a spiritual concept. But it's the idea of Zion is still potent, however it's used.
And we're still trying to figure it out.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would say, I don't know if it'll come up later when we're talking about this, but we actually let go of the term of Zion for probably a couple decades. because it was so imbued with the idea of having to be this gathering place here in Independence, Missouri, that it lost its ability to be have multiple meanings. And so in some ways we stopped using it for quite a while, and sometimes church leaders, sometimes church members who didn't live in Independence or Missouri felt like it was actually not a helpful idea if we were talking about gathering. Grant McMurray eventually brings it back, but redefines it for the church.
Right. And someone else was asking the question here in regard to when the sanitarium came about. And I would add to it Rest Haven.
Yes.
These organizations that actually took some of this and made it into practice. We have the largest thrift store in this area, in the social service center,
yeah,
yeah. that we were attempting to live that out in the only place that we could at that time, and that was in this area. And there were other places like Canada, in fact, it's still doing a great job.
They had its own experiments previously of, how do we share resources? How do we tithe but be good stewards and help each other too? So there've been different kinds of experiments.
So we can see how that was permeating with the culture at that time. Let's see. Jody was asking, where was Fred M. living during this time period? Independence.
Initially, Lamoni.
Lamoni, Independence, right. No, that's right.
Church headquarters moved
Right.
from Lamoni to Independence during that time.
And you mentioned driving cars to church. Was he in a place where cars were commonplace? My early 20th century knowledge isn't very strong. Trying to get a sense of membership then.
Would have been more common, like in the Kansas City area.
Yeah.
I mean,
this is the marker that I'm remembering as we've been reading through, is that Fred M.'s wife was hit by a car.
Oh.
And eventually
1926.
died from those injuries in 1926. And so, the car was around and no seatbelts, I'm sure, at that point. And
wow, goodness. Catherine says, I missed the last session. If Fred M. is traveling the world, he is not on the Council of 12. He was automatically appointed as prophet president.
well, he's not automatically appointed, but everybody knew
it
from
was still a vote of the
certainly
conference.
be voted by the conference, but that his father did indicate by revelation that he's to follow me. But Fred M. grew up basically he grew up kind of like the Archbishop William Temple in England, whose father was also the Archbishop of Canterbury. There it's referred to as being born to the purple.
Oh my.
Right. So
Well, and Fred M. was in the first presidency for, as we mentioned, for a long time. We couldn't remember exactly how many years, but he was already being trained in that role. So it was no surprise to the church recognized that this was intentional.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody would have called it automatic. It was just assumed, though, that in terms of their idea of lineage,
Especially then. Yeah.
Right. Well, and actually, Joseph Smith III, when he indicated that
That's true. Yeah, make sure.
that Fred M. was the designated, said unless he seems unfit for that role, in which case, it's up to the church to see who would be a better fit. So,
and one
it's
presumes
realistic.
Yeah.
one presumes after he became president, there were some old members of the Council of 12 who did kind of think he was unfit.
And that's one thing we really don't have time for tonight, and that is we did not spend much time talking about supreme directional control.
We did not.
Which was a divisive issue. It split the church in many ways. In fact, started a number of offshoot churches from our own. And
some of them eventually filtered back into the church, but some of them maintained for quite a while as a counter movement. Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that what we wanted to focus on was the theological
Yeah.
issues, and supreme directional control is what all the historians want to focus on. And you either like Fred for it or you hate Fred for it. We mentioned he's got this problem. He's inherited this church that's actually 14 churches, and they want him to lead, but they don't. But he has no way to lead because everybody's got their own fiefdom that they're running, and so That's part of his issue.
And that's been a pendulum swing also in the life of the church. The poor members of the Council of 12 who have, every administration had to learn what their new
Yeah.
position.
And,
Yeah.
and one of his things was, the apostles need to be these witnesses of Jesus Christ in the world. And so let's send them out to the different places where we want to seed the church. And, and some of them were really pretty open to doing that. But for some, it was just not feasible at all, whether because of age or because of this was not their view of how their role in the church should go. But yeah, there was, you're right, the 12 were going back and forth as far as, yeah, this is a good idea, we're behind him. And then
Well, some were.
some were, and he wasn't always generous to the 12.
In fairness to those who pushed back on Fred M for this, though, one of the underlying problems is that nobody is willing to bring into the clarity of conscious knowing that the reason everybody is concerned about autocracy is Joseph Smith Jr. in Nauvoo.
Right.
The PTSD from Nauvoo lingers long in the church, and so that's why Joseph III is warned by people who wanted to be present. Don't be careful with this.
And that's why that worked with Joseph Smith III.
Right.
Exactly. Again, a pendulum swings that we notice all through. One thing I did want to ask before we close up today is, so we are talking about the social gospel and how that's moving there. What are some other examples of organizations or churches that might still be existent today that were focused on the social gospel movement?
Well, so lots of what we'd call mainline Protestant churches have a history in the past social gospel movement. The social gospel movement, as Fred M encountered it kind of fades out as we get to the end of the Depression. But it doesn't die out. What happens is that it reconfigures itself in later kinds of theology that are socially concerned. Liberation theologies, African American theologies, they bear feminist theologies. All of these theologies have aspects that have some genetic markers from social gospel theology.
And it's not just churches, but other kinds of organizations like unions. So there was a church member who helped to organize a union in Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
There were other, I would say the civil rights movement in some ways is using some of the imagery and language of the social gospel movement as its language. So there's other organizations that were affected by it.
You're thinking of the labor organization?
Yes.
How did you?
Sean Fain.
Sean Fain.
I couldn't
Right.
remember his name.
AFL, right? AFL.
CIO.
Yeah.
Just a few years ago,
Mhm.
Sean Fain with Teamsters.
Teamsters.
It
Right.
was the Teamsters. And he was talking about the kingdom of God and the injustices in our society and about unions as being a way to be a voice. And this was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So that those traditions persist, but they take on new garb. We are a church that has imbibed social gospel traditions, and we kind of recast them in a very community of Christ way.
Well, and it's fascinating in a time, especially at the later part of his life, where also urbanization is starting to come in, and people are doing mondo urban development concepts that we didn't get suckered into that we kept in on the concepts of and we have I would think probably the Salvation Army was connected to this. I'm trying to make the connections as we are living in a time where we're looking again at the social structure of our world and asking those questions that were being asked by Fred M. Smith.
Yeah.
So last question is what we'll close on. Jane says, please say we're going to get more follow-up sessions. I would love to get to the post-war era. Well, Jane, guess what? They will be back with us in January for another two-part session, continuing on this discussion of how the church has changed and how our theology has changed and moved during this time. This is a nice thing. We have a number of ways in the church of going through what we're going through in this series. The Christian Ministry Certificate, which is offered through CIMM, is an 8-week program that you can go through that delves into much of this. And of course, there's courses in seminary through Community of Christ and Graceland Seminary